Avalanche. Chapter 10. Non-ordinary states of consciousness and the unconscious. The previous two chapters dealt with approaches to the unconscious through ordinary states of awareness. This chapter explores approaches to the unconscious through non-ordinary states of awareness. These non-ordinary states are aspects of augmented or expanded consciousness, of sensitive awareness or heightened intuition. They are usually referred to as psychic, transcendental, sacred, or transformational, and are generated through the use of hallucinogenics and or activities that force extreme imbalances in the biochemistry of the body, such as those produced through prolonged fasting, by hyperventilation, sensory deprivation, flagellation, and other forms of mortification of the flesh, near-death events, the crises of illness, formal initiations and inductions conducted by teachers, and the augmented states of consciousness that occur during times of extreme collective crisis, such as those involving natural catastrophe or war. The important point is that expanded states cannot be experienced while one is in ordinary consciousness. Ordinary consciousness must be left behind, and one must enter a completely different vehicle of awareness. The situations mentioned above seem somehow to thin the veil that separates the conscious and the ordinary from the unconscious and the non-ordinary. One must remember that these experiences do not cause the realms of non-ordinary consciousness to exist. They merely make entry into them easier. One often hears that an illness was the cause of an unusual state of consciousness, or that a drug was responsible for expanded experience. This misses the crucial point. The unconscious exists and functions whether we are consciously aware of its existence or not. Chemical substances and unusual events do not create the unconscious. I believe all or psychic experiences are products of transcendental states of consciousness, though not all transcendental states of consciousness produce experiences. There are transcendental or expanded states of awareness in which no unusual power or psychic phenomenon is evoked. Entering the silence, a state of pure being, is a good example of this. But whether or not a transcendental state includes an experience of psi abilities, it does always call for a total revision of one's opinion of what is and what is not when it is experienced for the first time. Most of us have a peculiar value system about reality. We don't know about something, anything. We assume it probably doesn't exist. No, if we don't know about something, anything, we assume it probably doesn't exist. For example, most people don't believe the unconscious exists simply because they don't experience it. This changes radically when the expanded aspects actually are experienced. The usual response is, I don't believe it. The next most common response is, you're going to think I'm nuts, but It is interesting to observe how people attempt to defend themselves from the experience of a psi awareness or a transcendental breakthrough. Although non-ordinary states of consciousness do often frighten and overwhelm an individual when they are first encountered, the same individual may ultimately learn to be quite comfortable with them, discovering how to enter them and how to leave them volitionally through simple shifts in focus or attention. Most people, however, repress such experience unless they are under the guidance of a teacher who is familiar with the phenomena of the unconscious. In our society, I have found very few individuals who are able to present unencumbered pathways into the unconscious realms of self. Most spiritual teachers are heavily biased with more moralistic or cultural dogma, a tendency to seduce students into exclusively mental or intellectual dimensions, particularly those that tend to demean the body, or the teaching of the womb state, escapist propaganda, or the teaching of womb state, escapist propaganda, and misinformation that can enmesh rather than liberate the individual who seeks awakening. Teachers who carry a divine mother or a divine father pattern are examples of those who are prone to create that kind of enmeshment. A student may feel wonderful about them, but there is little hope of mature development. Years of guided practice are usually required for one to learn to handle the raw unconscious forces, if one survives the entry into the unconscious in the first place. There is always the probability of death or permanent psychological injury when ordinary awareness encounters the forces of the transcendent. The sacrifice can be enormous in many ways, not the least of which involves the permanent loss of one's conscious innocence. The psychic phenomena that are encountered take many forms. They might involve a shaman commanding the elements, the oracle of Tibet, prognosticating in regard to future events, St. John receiving the visions of the Book of Revelation, psychics channeling material for individuals and collectives, healers affecting the miraculous through touch, martial artists manipulating physical and psychological forces, individuals performing telekinesis, intuitive analysis, interpreting dreams, Hitler moving the masses, Jesus transfiguring on the mountaintop, gurus teaching pathways into beinghood, or a priest psychospiritually substantiating bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. Regardless of what the particular phenomena may be, all of the people who do these things are operating from states of awareness beyond the ordinary, though well within areas known to be aspects of the unconscious self. I repeat, the outer mind, the ordinary self, is incapable of performing such feats. It will be and will never be able to perform such feats. Only through initiation into the unconscious, the expanded aspects of self, can we begin to explore and to experience the powers, realizations, wisdoms, and revelations that are ours through spiritual inheritance and by right of initiation. When I am in a state of consciousness in which I am somehow accessing information about people, events, or places that is not coming from my usual awareness, there is a part of me that is always surprised and amazed. I don't know how it's actually happening. I do not know I am not in an ordinary state of consciousness. I feel hyper alert as the information flows to me, either as sudden insights, flashes of images, or a voice tells me about a person, event, or place. At such times, my awareness seems to tune in to the general information. Rarely do I have access to detailed telepathic material. Similarly, in the feeling ranges, the general underlying emotional patterning of an individual is more accessible to me than is specific knowledge of physical, mental, or sexual material. It turns out that the same techniques for intuiting things about a single individual also work when one is psychically exploring a group of people, a community, or a nation. One reads and senses the group forces. It is like reading a vector force in physics. And interestingly, when I am reading a group, the action of the whole group becomes predictable, while the actions of the individuals in the group become impossible to predict. When I am reading an individual, I lose track of the collective energy. Often, observers believe a person who is demonstrating these dynamics is somehow going inside the heads of others, or in the case of shamans, is entering a plant or animal to gain access and understanding and information. I do not believe such to be the case. A most profound realization is this: when these events occur, one enters dimensions of one's own unconscious, wherein an equivalence of all that is or ever shall be exists. This must operate similarly to the way holographic principles operate. My involvement with psychic phenomena has come to me gradually and usually in the most unexpected ways. Most often when I have had a need for guidance or help, rather than presenting an elaborate account of my experiences with these phenomena, I will simply and briefly describe the outstanding features of some of the encounters I have had. The first time I really knew that I could tune in to nature for guidance and healing was while I was living on the island of Kauai. I had sustained a very painful knee injury, and an extremely unusual thought came to me. Perhaps I could let my intuition guide me to a tree that would heal my knee. I allowed myself to be guided by how my knee felt when I pressed it against several different types of trees. With some trees, the pain increased. With others, it stayed the same. But with one kind of banana tree, the knee felt as if someone had incised it and drained all the pain and injury out. My knee was fully restored to normal in less than an hour. I didn't, however, bother trying to figure out what did what. I also allow extended ranges of awareness to take over when I'm searching for sacred sites by quieting and entering my heart center and waiting for inner direction. I may meander for a while until suddenly a knowing strikes my awareness and the direction I need to take becomes evident. While I was with a group on the Colorado River, rafting and camping in the spectacular Grand Canyon, a dental surgeon who was with us became excited about his ability to make the clouds dissolve. I validated his discovery by telling him about Hannah Veery, the Hawaiian elder who taught me that one could ask the rain clouds to go away when the sun was needed, as long as one welcomed the clouds back afterwards. The trick was to perform a personal relationship with the clouds. One simply chanted to the clouds and expected them to leave. When that worked for me, I had not tried to figure out what was doing what. I also told the dental surgeon that when I do such a thing with a cloud, I often simply imagine that I am seeing through it, and then I envision it disappearing. I feel an unusual energy swirling about my head and a strange, heightened mental activity. When this process works, I am astonished. When he did it himself, the dental surgeon was intoxicated by the experience, though we both forgot to welcome the clouds back after we finished. We had a terrible rain that evening. I didn't try to figure out what was doing what. One particularly interesting experience of psi phenomena occurred during a powerful ritual ceremony in the Gobi Desert of Outer Mongolia, in which I participated with 12 other men. The ritual required that we leave an isolated desert yurt compound and walk out into the open desert. After opening my intuition for direction, I recognized what seemed obvious, that the site for the ritual was one where the ground reflected an unusual radiance, a kind of glow. The night sky was heavily overcast. 2 hours later, nearing the end of the ritual, I looked up and I saw a vast circular opening in the heavy overcast, an opening into the starry sky directly above us. It was as if an eye had opened through which we might peer into the infinite, or the infinite might peer at us. The moment we concluded the ritual, the opening began to disappear, and in 20 minutes the heavy overcast had returned to its pre-ritual condition. I didn't bother trying to figure out what was doing what. Then, in Joy's way, I described my initial experiences with healing, with becoming able to feel the subtle energies radiating from the body and with radiating energies into another person's body. Unfortunately, in that regard, I have spent years trying to figure out what is doing what. What may not appear to the outer mind to be destructive may appear to the unconscious to be rectifying and healing. This is particularly true for individuals and societies that maintain excessively rigid controls on human expression. With this in mind, I will present in this section some insights and perspectives that may be unpalatable, unpopular, or even forbidden to many people. Viewpoints related to the use of drugs and to collective crises, both of which can unleash the rich ranges of the forces of the unconscious, whether individual or collective, whether constructive or destructive. I have been impressed with certain individuals who have survived the ravages of chaos, whether the black pit of alcoholism and drug abuse or the extreme trauma of war. They seem to have gained a depth of maturity, a compassion, and a rich spirituality that is completely absent in people who are naive and untraumatized. It is as though such chaos is a contemporary rite of passage, an initiation that one was previously handled through sacred rites and vision quests, and that selects out those individuals that have the interior resources to become the great teachers, priests, healers, and sages for a clan or a collective. When that happens, it isn't the first time life, through an eruption of unconscious forces, has sacrificed the many for the few. Rarely do we ever have an overview of our own personal unconscious forces, and even more rarely do we ever see the unconscious dynamics of society. But a powerful way to observe the unconscious forces that dance any individual or any collective is to see how a person or a group actually lives life, as opposed to how each thinks life ought to be lived. In taking this view, however, we must remember that it is a transpersonal one, and therefore impersonal. It does not involve our feelings at the personal level. When we observe life from this sort of interpersonal viewpoint, we can appreciate that every major culture, all human we can appreciate that in every major culture, all human experiences, from the most constructive and stable to the most destructive and unstable, regenerate themselves. Life has had billions of years to rid itself of that which does not function or which does not support it to some degree. It has also had time to nurture and enhance that which is functional and adaptable. Most of us have an easy time appreciating the constructive aspects. What about the destructive and chaotic aspects? With the latter part of that inquiry in mind, I have found immense value in asking another version of the forbidden question: how do these disowned societal elements serve us collectively in terms of the full rhythms of life? I'm going to read that sentence again. How do these disowned societal elements serve us collectively in terms of the full rhythms of life? When I ask that, I begin to understand the collective social dynamics from a very different viewpoint than when I do not ask the forbidden question. One such understanding is that a person whose existence has been overly protected and overly controlled, tending towards abstraction and sterilization, is actually balanced by chaos. The same holds true when war or social chaos erupts in a collective. War is a transcendent event. War is a transcendent event which ushers in great change and invariably brings individuals and groups into a greater creative unfoldment. whether a particular individual or group is the victor or the victim. The warrior general energetics are incarnated. The warrior, capital W, / general, capital G, energetics, the warrior general energetics are incarnated, either consciously or unconsciously, in every generation in certain individuals, whether biologically male or female. They are on call, so to speak, ready to serve the collective in times of chaos and change. They may also be called to initiate chaos and change, and not just to protect a society. Not every generation will use the resources contained in these great patterns, and the individuals carrying such forces will experience a lack of fulfillment of destiny during times of prolonged peace, or when a society scorns this particular aspect of itself. Much of the current undermining of the warrior general patterning is involved with the collapse of sacred values that once gave meaning to death and destruction during times of upheaval. The collapse of this aspect of the masculine may well have to do with the emergence of attitudes and values reflecting the positive aspect of the feminine / great mother patterns that serve to modulate the intellectual and impersonal power of the masculine. But when they are overvalued, they can also cause emasculation and the collapse of a society. This is a strong contemporary possibility. Women in general are currently too invested in the masculine to be able to fully activate the feminine complement at its transcendental collective level in order to effect a healing reconnection of the mind to the body and of the human being to the earth. I'm going to read that sentence again. Women, in general, are currently too invested in the masculine to be able to fully activate the feminine complement at its transcendental collective level in order to effect a healing reconnection of the mind to the body and of the human being to the earth. Things will probably have to get much worse before the collective feminine can break the entrancement of the daughter for the father and thereafter rebirth the mature woman. The current wave of sentiment against war and chaos and against the use of power for the maintenance of peace through defensive strength denies aspects of both the personal self and the collective self, aspects that have served and will continue to serve life, ourselves and all collectives, whether we have the maturity to accept them as part of our view of wholeness or not. Denial or diminishment do not rid us of the aspects of self that defend, conquer, or destroy. In our culture, which generally perceives itself as peaceful and law-abiding, look at how the ghettos and the huge numbers of individuals utilizing drugs and alcohol maintain the environments of war and destruction. In fact, denial individually and collectively, only increases the destructive potential inherent in the immortal warrior general patterning. It can, and it has, turned upon its own people in the past. It can destroy a civilization when it is not properly integrated as an aspect of the societal self. As an exercise in maturation, I have often asked individuals to consider embracing viewpoints about war and peace that are diametrically opposed from their actual beliefs. For instance, I have asked that they contemplate 10 reasons why war serves a collective and 10 reasons why peace does not serve a collective. Upon doing this, they usually begin to feel the power of shifts in perspectives. Forbidden thoughts lead to the most amazing realizations if one has the courage to think forbidden thoughts. We can expect, in fact, that whenever we as a society or as an aspect of society publicly deny an attribute of our natural self, there will be, in our private lives, an eruption of that which has been denied. Child abuse, in its sexual form, is a particularly good example of this principle. It is not that child sexual abuse is right. It is that the conscious denial of our incestuous nature is wrong. The conscious denial of our incestuous nature is wrong. The presence of street gangs, violence, drug addiction, and unbridled sex in every great city of the world must also point to a larger mystery, something more than just bad or evil persons doing bad and evil things. When we see these powerful forces sweeping through large numbers of people, such as those who are using street drugs, those who are involved with associated violence, crime, chaos, sex, and death, some deep and profound and ultimately transforming, life-enhancing action by the collective unconscious is being released, an action that ultimately benefits life, although individuals and collectives may be the short-term sacrifices. One very interesting possibility that I'm considering is that the increase in violence, sex, and drug use depicted on television, a screen into our unconscious nature, may be coming about because large numbers of people are being prepared for life-threatening changes in the Earth's atmosphere, disruption in the world's economic markets, political revolutions, or nuclear chaos, and life is taking out insurance, assuring that sufficient numbers of people will know how to survive disruption and calamity, and will be able to transmit the seeds of future life. Television programming, along with what is available through home video technology, may be providing the balancing and therefore healing experiences necessary for our survival. The level of our consciousness that reads pattern experiences, screen images as real, no matter what the intellect has to say about it. With this in mind, I find it most revealing that everywhere in the United States, the films most people prefer to view in the privacy of their own homes present hardcore pornography. But this should not really be unexpected, given the general societal repression of sexuality and the fundamental importance of sexuality to human existence, and what films and sure moneymakers in the fundamentalist Christian areas of the United States, and what films are sure moneymakers in the fundamental Christian areas of the United States? Horror movies. All of this makes sense when we appreciate how the unconscious balances and protects itself from forces that may produce limitation or sterilization. Life seeks to be fully expressed. Motion pictures which carry male violence, whether in the form of war, cops and robber conflicts, or shootouts in the Old West, are male initiation experiences which, in my opinion, are necessary to the deeper well-being of the collective. Far better and cheaper for males collectively to experience these rites and rituals on television than to enact them in the outer realities. And I do understand the feminine perspective, which abhors such rites and rituals. Of course, an aspect of the feminine defends against such activities, as they represent the collapse of the maternal and the loss of the son to the father and the loss of the boy to the masculine principle. There are feminine aspects that do celebrate war, though. For instance, the whores and the Amazons. Rites of passage, initiations, chaos, and the forces of change are regularly being experienced by the very individuals we seek to cast out of our societal embrace. If a major calamity were to suddenly present itself, my money would be on the ghetto people, the criminals, the homeless, and the outcasts of society as the ones who would seed the future. Most of us who are completely dependent on the food and water supplies of a large, complex society would have little chance of surviving a complete civil collapse. The parts of an individual or a society that survive chaos and carry life forward are always very different from the parts that survive only during peaceful or relative calm, during peacetime or relative calm. So, whether it be world wars, limited revolutions, or gangs in central urban areas, the collective unconscious is dancing the patterns of chaos and survival, perhaps foreshadowing some future disaster. Maybe we should read the signs and omens of potential collective collapse and appreciate how the unconscious moves to ensure the survival of the collective seed, even though individuals and personal values are always sacrificed in these situations. And if we need confirmation of these statements, we should simply examine the sacred texts of any great religion or the histories of the rise and fall of civilizations. Rites of passage, initiations, chaos, and the forces of change are regularly being experienced by the very individuals we seek to cast out of our societal embrace. If a major calamity were to suddenly present itself, my money would be on the ghetto people, the criminals, the homeless, the outcasts of society. as the ones who would seed the future. Most of us who are completely dependent on the food and water supplies of a large, complex society would have little chance of survival of a complete civil collapse. The parts of an individual or a society that survive chaos and carry life forward are always very different from the parts that survive only during peaceful or relative calm. So, whether it be world wars, limited revolutions, or gangs in central urban areas, the collective unconscious dancing the patterns of chaos and survival, perhaps foreshadowing some future disaster. Maybe we should read the signs and omens of potential collective collapse and appreciate how the unconscious moves to ensure the survival of the collective seed, even though the individuals and personal values are always sacrificed in these situations. And if we need the confirmation of these statements, we should simply examine the sacred texts of any great religion or the histories of the rise and fall of civilization. I alluded earlier to another pattern that can be discerned in contemporary Western society, which is that of the collapse of the sacred father image. If this were happening in just the military area of your culture, for example, it would be viewed as an isolated peculiarity. But the collapse of the great paternal pattern as a source of stability and guidance is evident everywhere, in religion, law, politics, medicine, the family, and the science. Something awesome is transpiring in our culture at the family, societal, political, scientific, and religious levels. The only thing that can account for such a pandemic of collapsing father figures is an eruption from the collective unconscious. Are we preparing for the birth of a new god, goddess, or is the great feminine awakening from her long sleep? Can we trust that when collapse and or change becomes evident, the unconscious is initiating new possibilities? Are the chaos and pain centered around the birth process somehow reflected in any great change, almost as if the wisdom of matter recognizes the value of the struggle and crisis in ways to activate resources not ordinarily available? The terrifying godlike forces that can be unshackled during times of extreme devastation confront the conscious mind with its own mortality and insignificance. Yet paradoxically, in the very same havoc, the immortal and transcendental are more easily accessed and experienced. Individuals are swept up in forces far beyond anything they could have imagined as the gods and goddesses dance them with wild abandon. The degree to which the demon and its dragons are released is the same degree to which the great Redeemer and its angels are also released into the world of man and woman. It is high theater, the mystery play, undiluted. During times of catastrophic change, each individual has the opportunity to feel fully alive and resource-filled, awake far beyond the daily soporific states of consciousness in which most of us reside. Initiations that take us beyond the innocent and the naive are evoked. We can appreciate how individuals are fulfilled through such lifestyles as those that involve gangs, drugs, violence, crime, and unfettered sexuality. Why these aspects have been worshipped by so many people in so many different times in so many different places, and why violent films are favored by the masses, and why the masses may deify war or major crises. We must understand that taking governmental action against such so-called deviant behavior only serves the underlying patterning. It constellates the enemy for both sides and empowers the dark and light warrior general patterns. We may consciously declare that we oppose war, yet we unconsciously precipitate forms of war to serve the unconscious and disowned destructive elements of our collective. The best and the worst of the human being are demonstrated during these times. They are so important to us that we even establish clubs and organizations to celebrate and to recall the events of great of great dishevelment or chaos. Dishevelment. That's it. They are so important to us that we even establish clubs and organizations to celebrate and to recall the events of great dishevelment or chaos. Much of religion celebrates times of chaos, nurturing images of future collapse through an ultimate and concluding divine act of world destruction. Is the situation much different in our ghettos and slums? Physically, sensually, sexually, and emotionally are all powerfully experienced here? No. Let me read that again. Is the situation much different in our ghettos and slums? Physically, sensually, sexuality, emotionality are all powerfully experienced there, and often in much more healthy ways than the majority of our population experiences these primary forces. Male and female initiations and vital, often traumatic, social strife are encountered daily. Are individuals in these settings not seeking meaning and significance too? Although through values and behaviors that resist the herd consciousness of the rest of society, do they not therefore act as seed beds of new potential, a creative crucible of human life? Living in ghettos or slums is a very real and powerful mode of existence from life's standpoint. There is no getting rid of it. It is too successful. And when I say this, I'm not insensitive to the chaos, destruction, suffering, and pain that accompany such expressions of living life, and not merely observing or intellectualizing it. They are real. Their world is real. Life is real. Death is real. Living on an edge heightens the human awareness. It does not dull it. A lot of psychiatrists and therapists would be out of work if we allowed social outcasts to conduct seminars on how to vitalize our life. Although it is true that the lifestyles of these inner city individuals are often stressful, if not traumatic, and a number will not survive the challenges, either physically or psychologically, this doesn't imply that their lives will have been in vain. Meaning in life and fulfillment of destiny are not functions of life's duration, its quality, or its relationship to consensual standards of morality. Meaning is a function of inner, personal, psychological sense of whether one's role in relationship to the larger forces of life, as one perceives them, has been completed. Oh, that seems like an important sentence. I'm going to reread it. Meaning is a function of an inner personal psychological sense of whether one's role in relationship to the larger forces of life as one perceives them has been completed. When we give physicians the right to drug the greater portion of the population with Valium, yet we react powerfully against other drugs that stimulate and excite and give a sense of heightened awareness, someone or something is actually controlling and calming life and not allowing its fuller, more balanced expression. The explosive impact of the drug culture in the 1960s was probably the single most important event in recent Western history in terms of opening the partition between the unconscious and the conscious aspects of self, allowing dimensions of being previously inaccessible to the masses to be more easily accessed via dreams, meditations, vision quests, prayer, and other non-drug-induced states. The sacrifice, however, was enormous, just as it has been with war. The loss in life that occurs whenever the dark side of the unconscious breaks through into the outer realities is staggering, frightening, and very, very impersonal. Pain and suffering, neurosis, psychosis, and other awesome impersonal forces that shake human psyche to its core were experienced in both instances during the height of the drug culture and during the world wars. Had we been trained to be aware of the unconscious and its power, we might have handled these experiences with greater awareness and less loss of life and psychological injury. As I noted before, however, decades are required to master the techniques necessary for dealing with the forces encountered in an exploration of the unconscious. We are yet a young life form, and our consciousness is in its infancy. If we seek to journey into the unconscious and to engage its range of forces, we are wise to remember the immense value of a centering image, an image that helps the psyche orient to a focal point of integration and well-being, no matter what forces may be encountered. Memorizing and contemplating sacred centering images is fundamental to the teachings of most esoteric schools. Without such images, the psyche is blown on the winds of the unconscious, with little hope of integration or maturation, and with the great possibility of psychological injury or death. In more traditional cultures, the stabilizing images, the sacred images of the collective were held and protected by the religious traditions, but in contemporary society, religious institutions do not have the influence over the masses that they did in the past. People regularly express life in ways that are different from what the religious dogmas hold to be appropriate or right, and sacred images have been diluted and eclipsed by technological and monetary values. Even within religious organizations, the dollar sign has greater power than the cross, but we would still find much value in having a centering image available and using it. I do not mean to suggest that I support a return to what served us in the past. That is exactly what we must not do. The tendency of the human psyche to regress under stress is one of the most tragic components of our nature. It leads either to mass hysteria or to infantile behavior that has few creative resources with which to deal with this new situations. What is called for is the ability to allow life to live through us and present to us the sacred image of the future, one that will stabilize a new order of our existence. The view of the planet Earth and our moon from hundreds of thousands of miles in space might be a good image to consider for that purpose. Morphine-like and hallucinogenic substances are endogenously produced and or released by the body during times of major stress, trauma, illness, and deprivation. Some of the world's celebrated mystical experiences evoked when spiritual aspirants flagellated, starved, hyperventilated, or powerfully abused their bodies may have been due, in part anyway, to this biochemical phenomenon. It was precisely that experience I wished to explore in the Sinai Desert in September of 1988. I wanted in some way to touch upon the redemption of painful personal guilt through sacrifice of the body, the dramatic, powerful, elemental uplifts of massive granite in the parched desert seemed like an ideal place to take on such a task. For those who are out of condition, the trail to the top of Moses Mountain, as the peak is called, is very difficult if one walks the entire distance from the monastery of St. Catherine to the temple dedicated to Moses. The first 2/3 of the route involves a slow, meandering camel path with gentle switchbacks, while the concluding 1/3 is very steep, 60 to 70 degree climb up ancient carved stone stairs maintained by dedicated pilgrims. To preserve their strength for the final push to the top, most people ride camels to the bottom of the stairs and then proceed proceed on foot. But whether one rides a camel part of the way or walks the entire trail, the trek to the top is definitely not easy for the average person. As penitence for the guilt I felt over various life experiences, I elected to walk the entire distance as a conscious act of contrition. As I approached the last third of the hike and the steep staircase, I was already exhausted and dehydrated, feeling faint, weak, and very vulnerable. My heart was pounding and skipping beats. My breathing was impaired by the altitude. I had been on a modified fast for a week before the journey into the Sinai, so not only was I undertaking an inherently punishing experience, but I was also doing it at a time when I was physically weak. Thus, several forces were coming together at once that could easily culminate in a crisis as I trudged up Moses Mountain. The worst of the climb, I knew, was yet ahead. I had so involved myself with this task that I now realized I might even die in the act of penitence. I stopped innumerable times. My legs were aching and wobbly. The steps and niches carved out by the devout over thousands of years faded in and out of my awareness as one single focus to reach the top, to free myself from the burden of my shame, took me completely. The pain was intense. Yet during this amazing experience, I began to see pain from an entirely different perspective. I welcomed it. I savored it. Completely exhausted, I reached the top and collapsed on the steps leading into the temple. Within a minute or two, I felt a gradual transformation of my mind and body. I felt myself move from a state of viscous density into one of lightness. And I not only felt the burden of shame slowly dissolve, but I also felt a state of supreme ecstasy begin to manifest. The world was changed from being form and matter into a sea of infinite color and light. And I had the impression that my body was being transformed and transfigured. An inner choir sang repetitively in a simple melody. Forgiven, you are forgiven. I bathed in a pool of tears and appreciation. The experience lasted 30 minutes, and only after that time did I finally begin to recognize how extraordinary the top of Moses Mountain and how moving were its great vistas. There is no doubt in my mind that this was a mystical ordeal. But I also have a skeptic and a scientist inside who constantly offer their opinions as to what happens. Was the experience generated solely by endogenous hallucinogenics augmented by a dangerously low blood sugar and an unstable cardiovascular system, or was the crisis a threshold to the healing power of the unconscious resources of spirit through penitence? Perhaps it was both. And on the deepest level, perhaps it really doesn't matter. I always had but little regard for individuals who sought redemption, self-healing, or the healing of a family member through acts of mortification of the flesh. But now I feel different. Maybe those people had insight into something I am just beginning to experience. Although accessing some of the unconscious aspects of self, one has the rights and privileges of gods and goddesses. These rights and privileges are limited only by each individual's capacity to leave the ego awareness and to enter collective vehicles of consciousness that can interact creatively with the unconscious. However, it is a dictum, an inviolate dictum, that the outer mind or ego awareness is not the vehicle of consciousness that can and should handle such forces. I was swimming from shore to a beautiful coral reef off the coast of Kenya in the fall of 1987. The day was spectacularly sunlit, with an amazing array of tropical fish schooling around the coral. The sandy bottom was a pristine white. Suddenly, as I swam between two coral outcroppings, I found myself facing a vertical drop into an absolute blackness of ocean. Psychologically, I was at the edge of my known ego universe, confronted with the infinite and the unknown, my unconscious, at the very least, and maybe even the unconscious. I didn't bother to center. Simple Brugh, who was in charge of the morning's excursion, was not equipped to handle this projection of the infinite. I swam as fast as my arms and legs could carry me back to the safety of the known and the sane. It was, after all, Simple Brugh's morning to play.